Some doors are locked to keep danger out. This one had been locked to make sure something living never came back. By the time Ethan Cole sees the cage through the smoke, the afternoon sky above Oregon's Cascade foothills has turned the color of an old penny. Ash drifts between the pines like gray snow, settling across the hood of his pickup and gathering along the shoulders of the abandoned forest road. Somewhere beyond the ridge, wildfire moves through dry timber with a low, distant murmur, almost like surf rolling against a shore. Ethan should already be heading east. The evacuation notice on his phone had been clear before the signal disappeared, and the air now carries that bitter scent of burned pine that tells him the wind has changed. Then he hears it. Scrape. Silence. Scrape. Ethan eases off the gas. For several seconds, there is only the idle of the truck and the faint hiss of ash against the windshield. Then it comes again, metal against something weak but determined. He steps out, boots sinking into dry needles beside the road. At 37, Ethan still moves with the controlled economy of the Navy SEAL he once was, but today there is no uniform, no team, no mission waiting for him. Only an old canvas jacket, dusty jeans, and a man who came into these mountains to empty a cabin and leave before sunset. Easy, he calls into the trees. Nothing answers. He follows the sound roughly 30 yards downhill until the brush opens around a small clearing. There, beneath a leaning cedar, sits a rusted wire cage. Inside lies a German shepherd. The dog's sable coat is dulled by dust and ash. His ribs show beneath his fur. An empty water bowl rests near one paw. Yet his amber eyes remain open, fixed on Ethan with an exhausted caution that somehow feels stronger than fear. Ethan crouches several feet away. Hey, buddy. The shepherd lifts his head an inch, then lets it fall again. Ethan looks at the cage door. A heavy padlock hangs from the latch. Not broken. Not accidental. Locked. From the outside. For a moment, Ethan says nothing. The forest seems to hold its breath with him. Then a gust moves through the trees, carrying fresh smoke across the clearing. Ethan glances toward the ridge and sees an orange glow flicker behind the dark trunks. He runs back to the truck, grabs a bolt cutter from behind the seat, and returns. The German shepherd watches every step. I'm getting you out. The cutter bites down. Once. Twice. The old lock finally gives. Ethan opens the cage and reaches carefully inside. The dog tries to stand, but his legs refuse him, and Ethan catches him gently against his chest. I've got you. For one quiet second, the shepherd allows his weight to rest there. Then something changes. His ears lift. His nose turns toward the smoke. Ethan carries him toward the road, but the dog begins to struggle, not away from Ethan, but toward the forest. He gives one weak whine and stretches his neck toward the trees. Ethan stops. What is it? Atlas does not know that name yet. Ethan does not know his story. But the dying dog looks past safety, past the truck, past the man who has just opened his cage, toward the growing orange light beneath the pines. And with what little strength he has left, he tries to go back. 3 hours earlier, Ethan Cole had expected the hardest part of his day to be deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. The cabin stood 12 miles west of the nearest small town, tucked beneath tall Douglas firs where the mountains folded into long green ridges. It had belonged to his uncle before passing quietly into Ethan's hands, along with a rusted toolbox, a stack of fishing maps, and more memories than Ethan wanted to sort through. At 37, Ethan had learned that leaving a place was often easier than deciding what it meant to you. Years as a United States Navy SEAL had trained him to notice details other people overlooked, but civilian life had given him too many quiet hours to notice things inside himself. He had been out of service long enough for his hair to grow beyond regulation and for old friends to stop asking when he planned to settle down. He never gave them an answer. That morning, he packed dishes into cardboard boxes, covered the furniture, and placed the cabin key on the kitchen counter. By early afternoon, smoke had begun drifting across the mountains. The radio warned that a wildfire farther west had crossed a containment line, and residents along several forest roads were advised to leave while routes remained open. Ethan loaded the final box into his pickup and looked once at the porch. He had come to close a chapter. Nothing more. 20 minutes later, a fallen branch forced him from the main road onto an older forestry route that curved north through the timber. The road was narrow and uneven, with weeds growing through cracks in the gravel. No houses stood nearby. No hikers should have been this deep in the evacuation zone. Ethan drove slowly, watching the sky darken behind the trees. Then came the sound, faint enough that he nearly dismissed it as a loose piece of metal somewhere in the truck bed. Scrape. He drove another 50 feet. Scrape. Ethan stopped. He listened. There it was again, coming from downhill. Every sensible thought told him to keep moving. Fire did not negotiate, and smoke already blurred the distant ridge. But Ethan had spent too much of his life learning the difference between harmless noise and a signal that something needed attention. He shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous. Probably nothing, he murmured, though he was already opening the door. He moved through the trees until the road disappeared behind him. The smell of dry earth mixed with pine and smoke. Then he noticed tire marks pressed into the soft shoulder below the road. They ended near a clearing. Ethan followed them and saw the cage beneath the cedar. Even from a distance, something about it felt wrong. It had not fallen from a vehicle. Someone had placed it there deliberately. Then two amber eyes opened behind the rusted wire. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. The German shepherd did not bark. He simply watched the stranger approaching through the ash. And Ethan, who had driven into the mountains determined to leave with nothing depending on him, took one look at that exhausted animal and understood that he was not going home alone. By the time Ethan carried the German shepherd toward the pickup, the wind had shifted again. Smoke moved between the trees in pale ribbons, turning the afternoon sun into a dim copper disk above the ridge. The dog rested heavily against Ethan's chest, weak enough that every breath seemed deliberate. Yet the moment they reached the road, his ears lifted toward the forest. He struggled once, twisting his head back toward the clearing. "Easy," Ethan said. "Whatever is back there, you cannot help it like this." The shepherd answered with a low whine. Ethan opened the passenger door and carefully settled him across an old wool blanket on the floorboard. Before closing the door, he looked back downhill. Something about the cage bothered him beyond the obvious cruelty of leaving an animal alone during an evacuation. He returned to the clearing for one final look. The padlock lay where he had cut it, half buried in ash. Ethan crouched beside the cage. The latch showed no damage except where his cutter had broken the lock. No bent wire. No broken hinge. No sign that the shepherd had wandered inside and become trapped. Beside the cage sat the empty water bowl, clean enough to suggest it had been placed there recently. Ethan looked toward the road and noticed the tire tracks again. One vehicle had left the forestry route, rolled down to the clearing, then backed out along the same path. Someone had driven here. Someone had unloaded the cage. Someone had locked the door. Ethan felt an old instinct return, quiet and unwelcome. Not anger. Attention. The kind that made the world narrow into details. Near the cedar, he found a short length of faded blue nylon caught beneath a root. It looked like part of an old leash. A few feet away, the ground held shallow impressions where something heavy had rested before being moved. Ethan stood and scanned the clearing. There were no homes nearby, no campsite, no reason for a dog cage to be here. A distant crack rolled through the forest as a dead limb fell somewhere beyond the ridge. Ethan looked up. The orange glow between the trees had grown brighter. Whatever questions remained would have to wait. He slipped the piece of blue nylon into his jacket pocket and hurried back to the truck. The shepherd had managed to raise his head. His amber eyes followed Ethan through the windshield, wary but awake. "We are leaving," Ethan said as he climbed behind the wheel. The dog looked past him toward the trees. Ethan started the engine and turned the pickup east. For the first half-mile, the shepherd remained still. Then they passed an old wooden marker pointing toward a narrow service road. The dog suddenly lifted his head higher. His nose worked rapidly against the smoky air coming through the vents. He tried to rise, failed, then pressed himself toward the passenger door and gave the same broken whine Ethan had heard at the clearing. Ethan slowed. The service road disappeared north beneath a canopy of dark firs. A weathered sign beside it carried only two words, Alder Creek. The shepherd stared at that road until it vanished behind them. Ethan glanced at him, then at the rearview mirror. "You know that place." The dog lowered his head, exhausted, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road behind them. Ethan tightened his hands around the steering wheel. He had rescued one life from the forest. For the first time, he began to wonder whether that life had been trying to lead him toward others. The first place Ethan found with lights still on was a small veterinary clinic 7 miles east of the evacuation boundary, where the highway widened beside a gas station and a volunteer fire department. By then, evening had settled over the valley, and smoke had softened the moon into a pale blur above the rooftops. Ethan carried the German Shepherd through the clinic doors wrapped in the wool blanket from his truck. The dog no longer fought to look behind him. That worried Ethan more than the whining had. Dr. Claire Bennett, a veterinarian in her early 40s, met them before the receptionist could finish speaking. She took one look at the shepherd and guided Ethan into an examination room. "How long was he out there?" she asked. "I do not know." Ethan watched her place a bowl of water near the dog, allowing him only small amounts at first. "I found him locked in a cage." Claire stopped for half a second. Then her hands continued working. "Locked from the outside." She said nothing more, but her expression changed. The next hour passed quietly. The shepherd was dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from irritated paws after exposure to heat and rough ground. But Claire found no reason to believe he could not recover. "He needs rest, fluids, food, and time," she said. "Mostly time." Ethan stood beside the table as the dog finally slept. For the first time since the clearing, his breathing looked peaceful. Ethan should have felt relief. Instead, he kept thinking about Alder Creek. Near midnight, a fire engine rolled past the clinic with its lights flashing silently against the windows. The shepherd woke instantly. His head rose. His ears pointed forward. He struggled to his feet and stared through the glass toward the western hills. "Easy," Ethan murmured. The dog stepped toward the door. Claire watched from across the room. "That is interesting. He did the same thing in the truck." Ethan told her about the service road and the sign. Claire looked at the shepherd. "That does not look like panic." It did not. There was no frantic pacing, no attempt to hide. The dog simply stood facing west, alert despite his exhaustion, as though listening for something only he understood. Ethan crouched beside him. "What did you leave back there?" The shepherd's ears twitched at Ethan's voice, but his gaze remained on the dark window. Later, Claire prepared a quiet recovery room with a blanket and a bowl of water. Ethan sat on the floor nearby, his back against the wall. He had planned to leave once the dog was stable. Instead, midnight became 1 in the morning, then 2. The shepherd eventually lay down, but he chose the floor near Ethan rather than the bed Claire had prepared. Several inches remained between them. Neither crossed the distance. Ethan understood that kind of caution. After leaving the Navy, he had spent years telling people he preferred being alone. It sounded cleaner than admitting he had forgotten how to let anyone depend on him. Near dawn, Ethan woke to something warm resting against his boot. The shepherd had shifted closer in his sleep. Ethan looked down but did not move his foot. Outside, another fire engine passed toward the mountains. The dog's eyes opened immediately. Again, he looked west. Again, toward Alder Creek. This time Ethan was already watching. "All right," he whispered. "I believe you." Morning arrived without sunlight. Smoke hung above the valley in a gray ceiling, and the clinic windows reflected a world that seemed caught between night and day. Dr. Claire Bennett returned just after 6 with coffee in one hand and a small scanner in the other. The German shepherd was awake beside Ethan's chair, watching every movement with quiet attention. "There is one thing I want to check again," Claire said. She knelt and carefully loosened the worn leather collar hidden beneath the thick fur around his neck. Ethan had barely noticed it in the smoke. The leather was faded almost black, cracked by weather and age. Claire turned it beneath the light and stopped. "There is something under here." Tucked behind the collar was a narrow metal identification tag, pressed so tightly against the leather that dirt had concealed most of its surface. Claire cleaned it with gauze. The lettering was faint, but still readable. "Atlas." Below the name was a telephone number and a small stamped line. "Alder Creek Kennels." Ethan stared at the words. "Alder Creek." The dog lifted his head at the sound. Claire looked from Ethan to Atlas. "I think you just found his name." Ethan crouched. "Atlas." The shepherd's ears rose. His amber eyes settled on Ethan immediately. There was no excitement, only recognition, quiet and unmistakable. Ethan repeated it more softly. "Atlas." The dog's tail moved once against the blanket. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. A name changed things. Yesterday, he had carried a dying animal from a cage. Now that animal had a history. Somewhere, he had belonged to someone. Claire called the number on the tag. Disconnected. Ethan searched the kennel name on his phone while the clinic still had service. The results were old. Alder Creek Kennels had once operated on private land north of the forestry road, almost 9 miles from where Ethan found the cage. Photographs from several years earlier showed a modest property surrounded by pine forest, with training yards, wooden shelters, and long fenced runs. The business had closed the previous winter. No current website. No recent contact information. Then Ethan found a county notice dated 8 months earlier confirming the property had changed ownership. He looked at Atlas. The shepherd was standing now, weak but determined, facing the window again. You came from there. Claire studied the map on Ethan's phone. Her expression tightened. The latest wildfire boundary was less than 3 miles southwest of the old property. Ethan remembered the tire tracks, the locked cage, the strip of blue nylon in his pocket. Atlas had not been abandoned by chance. Someone had transported him away from the kennel and left him where nobody was expected to return. Yet Atlas had spent every ounce of strength trying to look back toward Alder Creek. Ethan had known men who did the same thing after coming home. Their bodies safe, while some part of them remained behind with those they could not forget. He had done it himself. For years, he had carried the memory of a final overseas deployment, not as a story he told, but as an empty chair inside every quiet room. He never called it guilt. He simply stopped making promises he might fail to keep. Atlas stepped toward him and pressed his nose against Ethan's hand. Ethan looked down. You are worried about someone. Atlas turned toward the western window. Claire said nothing. She did not need to. Ethan opened the wildfire map again. Beyond the glass, smoke drifted over the hills, and somewhere behind it lay an abandoned kennel, a closed road, and whatever Atlas believed was still waiting there. By 8 that morning, Ethan had learned enough to know that going back alone would be reckless. The wildfire had shifted northeast overnight, closing 2 forest roads and placing Alder Creek near the edge of an expanded evacuation zone. Instead of turning toward the mountains, Ethan drove to the volunteer fire station across from the clinic. Atlas remained with Claire, though he protested Ethan's departure with one low whine from the recovery room. Inside the station, radios murmured beneath the smell of coffee, canvas gear, and smoke. Ethan found Fire Captain Daniel Mercer studying a county map spread across a folding table. Mercer was 52, broad through the shoulders, with tired blue eyes and a gray mustache that seemed permanently dusted with ash. Ethan explained everything without embellishment. The cage, the lock, the tire tracks, the identification tag, Atlas's reaction to Alder Creek, and the old kennel property inside the threatened area. Mercer listened carefully. You think animals are still there? I think the dog does. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. That is not enough to send people into an unstable fire zone. Ethan nodded. I know. He did know. Years of service had taught him that instinct mattered, but instinct without information could become another kind of danger. Mercer marked the property anyway and called the county animal response coordinator. 20 minutes later, new information came over the radio. A utility crew had reported smoke moving through a drainage north of the main fire line, near Alder Creek. Mercer looked at Ethan. That gets my attention. By late morning, a small assessment team was cleared to approach from the east along a service route that remained open. Ethan returned to the clinic only to give Claire the update. The moment Atlas saw the county map in Ethan's hand and smelled the blue nylon strap Ethan had removed from his jacket pocket, the shepherd rose. His legs were steadier now. Claire watched him cross the room and press his nose against the faded nylon. Then Atlas walked directly to the door. He should not be running anywhere, she said. But a slow ride and a short, controlled walk are different. Ethan looked at her. You are saying he can come? Claire sighed. I am saying he has been trying to tell us something since yesterday. An hour later, Atlas sat secured in the rear of Mercer's utility vehicle beside Ethan, wearing a borrowed harness. The convoy moved west beneath a sky washed gray with smoke. No sirens. No urgency wasted on noise. At the entrance to Alder Creek Road, they stopped. The old wooden sign stood exactly where Ethan remembered it. Atlas rose before anyone opened a door. His nose lifted. His body became still. Then he turned toward a narrow gravel spur branching north, nearly hidden by brush. Mercer checked the map. That road is not marked. Ethan opened the door and stepped out with Atlas on the lead. The shepherd moved carefully, conserving strength, But there was no hesitation in him now. 50 yards down the forgotten road, he stopped beside a fallen fence post and stared into the trees. Ethan heard nothing at first. Then, beneath the wind and the distant rumble of the fire, came a sound so faint he wondered whether he had imagined it. A bell. One soft metallic note. Then another. Atlas pulled forward and gave the first clear bark Ethan had heard from him. Somewhere beyond the smoke, something answered. The answer came again, faint and uneven, somewhere beyond the trees. Atlas stood perfectly still for half a second, listening. Then his tail lifted, and he pulled toward the sound. Ethan shortened the lead without stopping him. "Slow, buddy. I hear it." Captain Daniel Mercer signaled the rest of the team forward, and they followed the narrow gravel spur through a stand of firs where smoke drifted low across the ground. The bell sounded again. This time Ethan heard something beneath it, a frightened animal calling from farther ahead. Atlas answered with a bark, stronger than before. The old road curved around a rocky slope and opened onto a neglected property surrounded by weathered fencing. A wooden sign leaned beside the entrance, its faded letters barely visible beneath years of rain. Alder Creek Kennels. Several small buildings stood beyond the gate, their roofs coated with ash. No vehicles, no people, but Atlas knew the place. Ethan felt the change immediately. The shepherd stopped searching the air and began moving with certainty, leading them past an empty training yard toward a long wooden shelter at the rear of the property. Then the sounds became clear. Dogs. More than one. Mercer reached for his radio. "County response. We have live animals at the Alder Creek property. Send the animal transport unit to our eastern access point." Ethan approached the shelter with Atlas beside him. Inside separate fenced runs were 4 dogs, frightened and thirsty but standing, their water containers nearly empty. Farther behind the building, 2 goats waited inside a small paddock, and the bell Ethan had heard hung from the collar of the larger one. Atlas gave a soft whine. One of the dogs recognized him immediately, pressing close to the fence with its tail moving rapidly. Atlas stepped forward until their noses nearly touched through the wire. Ethan looked down at him. Now he understood. Atlas had not been trying to return to a place. He had been trying to return to a family. The team worked quickly and calmly. Water came first, then carriers, leads, and a safe route back toward the vehicles. No one needed to rush the animals. They only needed to keep moving. Ethan stayed beside Atlas as each dog was led away. With every departure, the shepherd seemed to stand a little taller. Then Mercer stopped near the northern fence. He was staring beyond the property into a shallow drainage filled with dry brush. "Ethan." The tone of his voice changed everything. A thin line of smoke was rising from the drainage, not from the southwest where the main wildfire burned, but from directly north of them. Mercer lifted his radio and reported the location. The reply came almost immediately. A spot fire had likely crossed ahead of the expected line, carried by windborne embers into the drainage. The terrain beyond it climbed toward thousands of acres of dense timber. Worse, the drainage curved east toward scattered rural homes outside the current evacuation boundary. The team had reached Alder Creek early enough to see what had not yet been visible from the highway. Mercer relayed coordinates, while another crew confirmed access from the north. Within minutes, plans changed across the radio. Resources were redirected. Residents farther east would be notified. Crews would work the safer edges before the small fire had time to become something larger. Ethan listened, one hand resting gently against Atlas's shoulder. The dog knew nothing about fire lines or county maps. He did not understand how many acres lay beyond those trees, or how many families lived beneath the eastern ridge. He had simply remembered those who had been left behind. That was enough. By early afternoon, the last animal was secured for transport. Atlas watched until the vehicle carrying the other dogs disappeared down the road. Only then did he turn back to Ethan. For the first time since the cage, he did not look toward the forest. He looked at the man beside him. Ethan crouched and touched the worn collar around Atlas's neck. "You got them out," he whispered. Atlas leaned forward and rested his forehead against Ethan's chest. Behind them, radios carried voices through the smoky air as crews moved toward the newly discovered fire. Ahead, the rescue vehicles traveled east with every animal accounted for. Ethan had believed he stopped on that forgotten road to save one dying dog. Standing beneath a gray Oregon sky with Atlas pressed quietly against him, He began to understand that mercy rarely knows where its work will end. 3 weeks later, rain finally came to the valley. It arrived softly before dawn, tapping against the windows of Ethan's cabin and washing the last traces of ash from the porch rails. The wildfire was contained. The spot fire near Alder Creek had been reached before it could spread beyond the drainage, and the families east of the ridge had returned home. The rescued animals had been examined, cared for, and placed with temporary foster families, while county officials worked through the abandoned property. Ethan followed those updates from a distance. There was only one animal whose future he could not bring himself to leave to chance. Atlas recovered slowly. His strength returned first, then his appetite, then the steady confidence in his walk. Trust took longer. A metal gate closing too loudly could make him freeze. The smell of heavy smoke from a neighbor's fireplace could send him searching for the nearest door. Some nights, he slept beside Ethan's bed. Other nights, he chose the hallway, where he could watch both the front entrance and the room behind him. Ethan never forced him closer. He understood that healing did not move in a straight line. Neither did his own. The cabin had been ready to sell when Ethan found Atlas. The boxes were packed. The furniture was covered. The key had been waiting on the counter. Yet every morning after they returned, Ethan found another reason not to leave. He repaired the loose porch step. He stacked firewood beneath the awning. He unpacked 2 coffee mugs, even though he only needed one. Then he bought a dog bed that Atlas ignored completely in favor of an old rug beside the fireplace. One cool evening, Ethan sat on the porch while Atlas rested several feet away. The forest smelled different after the rain, clean earth beneath the lingering scent of burned timber. Ethan held the faded blue nylon strap he had found near the cage. He had kept it without knowing why. Now he folded it once and placed it inside the old toolbox near the door. Some things deserved to be remembered. They did not have to be carried every day. Atlas watched him, amber eyes calm in the fading light. "You staying?" Ethan asked. The shepherd tilted his head. Ethan almost smiled. "That makes 2 of us." The adoption papers became official the following morning. Claire handed them across the clinic counter while Atlas sat beside Ethan's leg. "He chose you before you filled those out," she said. Ethan looked down at him. "I think he chose everybody else first." Claire smiled. "Maybe that is why he found you." That night, rain returned. Ethan left his bedroom door open as he always did. Atlas settled in the hallway, chin on his paws, watching the dark house. Ethan turned off the lamp. Minutes passed. Then came the quiet sound of paws crossing the wooden floor. Atlas entered the room, circled once beside the bed, and lay down. No fence separated him from the door. No chain held him there. Nothing prevented him from leaving. Ethan lowered one hand toward the edge of the mattress. Atlas moved closer until his head rested beneath it. Neither of them needed a promise. For the first time in years, Ethan fell asleep knowing another living soul trusted him to still be there in the morning. By early spring, the first green shoots were pushing through the blackened soil at Alder Creek. Winter rain had softened the scars across the hills, and where smoke once covered the sky, morning light now spilled between the pines in long golden bands. Ethan parked his pickup near the old forestry road and opened the passenger door. Atlas jumped down without hesitation. He had gained weight since autumn. His sable coat had recovered its deep color, and the quiet strength in his stride made it difficult to imagine the exhausted dog Ethan had once carried from these woods. They followed the trail toward the clearing together. No evacuation warning sounded from Ethan's phone. No ash drifted through the air. There was only the smell of wet earth, cedar, and new grass. When they reached the place beneath the leaning tree, Atlas stopped. The cage was gone. County workers had removed it months earlier, but a pale rectangle remained where the ground beneath it had been protected from fire and weather. Ethan stood a few feet behind Atlas and waited. He did not call him forward. Atlas lowered his nose to the earth and walked slowly around the empty space. For a moment, he became completely still. Then a breeze moved through the clearing, carrying the distant sound of birds from farther down the ridge. Atlas lifted his head. His ears turned toward the sound, and he walked on. Ethan followed. Near Alder Creek, new fencing had replaced the broken sections around the property, though the kennels themselves remained closed. The rescued dogs had all found permanent homes. The 2 goats had gone together to a small family farm outside the valley. Captain Daniel Mercer had sent Ethan a photograph of them standing beneath an apple tree, the old bell still hanging from the larger one's collar. Ethan kept that photograph on his refrigerator beside Atlas's adoption papers. They continued toward the drainage where the spot fire had been discovered. Small ferns were unfolding beside charred logs. Tiny pine seedlings stood only inches tall against the dark ground. Ethan crouched beside one of them, careful not to touch it. Once, he would have looked at this forest and seen only what had been lost. Now his eyes found what had returned. Atlas wandered several yards ahead, then noticed Ethan was no longer beside him. He stopped and looked back. Ethan smiled. "Go ahead." Atlas remained where he was, waiting. Ethan rose and joined him. Together they climbed toward the ridge. Ethan had never sold the cabin. The boxes were unpacked now. The old fishing maps were back on the wall. Firewood filled the rack beside the porch, and a German shepherd who once slept facing every exit had developed the habit of falling asleep wherever Ethan happened to be. Neither life had become perfect. Some memories still arrived without invitation. Some nights Atlas still lifted his head at unfamiliar sounds, and some mornings Ethan woke before sunrise with old thoughts sitting heavily in the silence. But now the silence belonged to two survivors instead of one. At the top of the ridge, Atlas stood in the spring sunlight, while the recovering forest stretched below them. Ethan rested a hand between the shepherd's ears. Months earlier, one small sound from a forgotten cage had made him stop his truck. That single decision had reached farther than either of them could have known. Perhaps grace was often that quiet. Not thunder, not some impossible sign from heaven. Just one living soul refusing to pass another by. Atlas stepped forward, then looked back once more. Ethan followed him into the trees, where beneath the burned branches, the forest was beginning again.